Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the core class. This is the fourth and final episode of the Basics of Biblical Justice. I'm glad everyone's been able to join us, and I have to commend everyone. I didn't see anybody falling asleep in any of the 4 weeks, and so that's
All right.
That's impressive. So let's pray and we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another opportunity to study your word. Please guide us as we do so and give us understanding. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, we're in Exodus chapter 22. And the subject tonight is regarding the justice regarding theft, property damage, and bailment. What we see here in this section, I believe, delineates what we saw in the Ten Commandments in chapter 20, verse 15, where it said not to steal. So now we're getting some delineations of that. As I mentioned last week, just like in the last chapter, I think the key verse is in the middle. Remember last week when we were talking about personal injury, the key verse was in verse 23 where it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And there we learned with personal injury law in the Bible that there's a one-for-one correspondence with regard to remediation for damages. And this week, the primary verse is in verse 9. The primary theme is in verse 9. And that's where we see the law of double. Now, this is called double. The word that's used here is the word shanaim, which means two, the law of two. And that way, like I said last week, the whole point in each case, 1-for-1 for personal injury or 2-for-1 for theft, is that in essence you're putting the perpetrator in the position that they put the victim, and the victim in the position that the perpetrator was in. So the bad guy ends up being one item short from what was stolen. This is all in keeping with one's intent. Now, one other word I want to mention here is restitution. You'll see the word restitution used here. That's a little different than the law of two. Now, the law of two it's called the law of two here because that's the word that's used in Hebrew. When you see it in Talmud, the rabbis would use the word kefil. It just means double. Now, restitution is really just compensating someone for their loss, and you'll see that word referenced a few times here. That's more like a 1-for-1, and there's a special situation for that. The idea with these key verses, like we saw last week, is that there's an overlying principle, and what we read before that key verse and what we read after really has to do more with exceptions and special situations. And so if we understand those verses in the light of the main verse, I think that will bring a little more understanding. So let's start with the first section here. That's in the first 4 verses. And the reason this is an exception, I think, is because it has to do with living things. And we'll see that right in these 4 verses, we got 3 different possible forms of compensation. So let's read through it and we'll work backward, or we'll go back through it and look at the details. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed, but if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. A thief must certainly make restitution, but if he has nothing, he must be sold for his theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in his possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, he must pay back double. So, let me deal with the 2 verses here that seem to be an insertion, okay? Because we're talking about animals, and all of a sudden we read about breaking in and getting caught by a defender and making restitution. I think these are insertions. I'm not sure why they're here, but the first one has to do with the thief that is caught when he's breaking in. This is important, regardless of why it's actually inserted here. I think it's important because it's possible that in the case of theft, someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night. My understanding of this is that you have no idea what the person's purpose is in being there, whether they intend to steal something or whether they intend to cause you harm. And because it's dark out, there weren't any flashlights back then. You don't just flip on the lights. You have no idea of the person's intent, and you have every right to defend yourself to the death. And that's why this is mentioned, that if someone breaks into your house, even if it is for a theft, you don't know. And let's say there's a struggle and you kill the person, it will not be considered murder. So it's not a violation of one of the 10 Commandments. That might be the reason that it's inserted here, is that a thief might be breaking in. So we have it mentioned in the theft chapter. But that's the caveat there, that you will not be guilty of bloodshed if injury is incurred by the person who broke in. And we also mentioned verse 3 last week about a thief making restitution. They have to be sold to pay for their theft. And even though we didn't cover it last week, at the beginning of the last chapter, there was a small section on slavery, indentured servitude. To whatever degree that would be, whether it's full-time or whether it's part-time, there are times when someone steals something and they have to pay, obviously, they have to pay for their theft, but they are unable to do so. So what do? You don't just let them go. They have to be sold into slavery to pay for that, to whatever extent that is. I think I mentioned last week that there is an Aramaic translation of the book of Esther, and I won't get into the details, but there's a situation there where someone owed a debt and they could not pay it, and so they hired themselves out 1 day a week. That was the payment for their theft. Honestly, it's kind of the same thing today when we garnish someone's wages. If you make $500 a week and you have to pay somebody $100 a week because of some damage that you caused them, essentially you're working for that person 1 day a week. So let's get to the real heart of these first 4 verses here. And this is why it's an exception. If the ox or the sheep or the donkey are in someone's possession, if they slaughter it and sell it, they have to pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 for the sheep. Now, this is much more than the law of double or the law of 2. Anybody want to guess why that might be, where you have to pay back so much more for a living animal that's been slaughtered or sold?
Because you have to feed it. Doesn't it cost you something to feed an animal, to take care of it?
Well, yeah, that's true too.
Is a cattle worth a lot less than an ox, for example? Was an ox that special?
Well, yeah, an ox would be, it's a bigger animal.
Yeah.
And, I think the thing here is that it's taken into consideration the potential for breeding.
Okay.
So if you steal an ox or a sheep and slaughter it, the person is not only losing that animal, they're losing all the descendants, yes. And so that has to be taken into consideration. Now, if the animal is found in their possession, then it reverts back to the primary rule. That's what we see in verse 4, that they just pay back double, because they're giving back the animal that they took plus 1 more. There's more to be said on that in some of our Talmud passages, but we'll come back to that. So any questions on the theft of animals?
Could you comment, Jim, on you talked about verse 3, but the first, 3a, so to say, where it talks about the difference if if the defender acts after sundown.
Oh, thank you.
I think that's a really interesting, I mean, I think I know where it's going, but I appreciate your.
Well, that way, if someone breaks in during the day, you can see them. And for example, you know whether or not they have a weapon in their hands. And I think that's really the big difference there. And you can see who it is.
So they expect more self-control.
Yes.
That you wouldn't necessarily just, just try to kill them with one blow that you might at night, right?
Right.
Where you don't know
There's,
who they are, what they have.
Yeah, exactly. At night, you don't know why they're there and what they possess, what they have in their hand. And so, yeah, there's more culpability to the defender when it's daylight. Yeah, good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, let's go on to property damage. This has to do with things that get out of control. So this is verses 5 and 6. It just gives us two examples. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray, and they graze in another man's field, he must make a restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain, or standing grain, or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. Two things here. The main point is, I guess the word would be culpability by way of negligence. Now, this person did not necessarily intend on causing damage to the neighbor, but they are responsible for these things that can cause damage. See a term up at the top. I'm saying here that this is, I think, if you notice, it's making restitution. That's really the first point. There's not this law of double here. And that's why that's an exception to the rule. Restitution is straight compensation for damages. And I think the reason that this is an exception because there's a lack of what is known as mens rea, and there's a lack of personal benefit. The person who let their sheep graze in someone else's field or let a fire get out of control has not benefited from their neighbor's loss, like a thief would. And so that's why I think it's just restitution and not double. The other thing has to do with mens rea. That's, if you see the Wikipedia definition up in the introduction. It's actually a legal term, and literally it means guilty mind, but we might call it criminal intent. And that's a mental element of a person's intention to commit a crime, or knowledge that one's action or lack of action would cause a crime to be committed. So this is assuming that the person wasn't paying attention or was outside their control. However, they started the fire on their own property, and in the case of the animals eating other folks' crops, he owns the animal, so therefore he's responsible. Remember this situation last week with a bull that gores someone? The owner is culpable, and he suffers loss one way or the other, even if the animal did not have a habit of doing it. The note that I have there, where it says owner liability for livestock or fire doing what it normally does. Last week, when we talked about personal injury, the idea there is that a bull does not normally gore a human being to death. And that's why it makes the stipulation that if it has done it more than once, then all of a sudden now it's got a habit. In this particular case, fire burns. You know that's what it's going to do. And animals eat. There's in the Talmud that there's a whole long list of things that animals do naturally. And you only can hold the owner culpable for so many things. Like, for example, the goring thing obviously is not something that comes natural. However, breaking things by walking over them. An animal does that. If it's on the ground, they're going to step on it. or if there's food laying around, they eat. That's something that an animal normally does. It's that actually is taken into consideration when you're discerning culpability of the owner. And in this particular case, we know that's what a fire does, and we know that's what animals do, is they eat. So you can't hold the owner more responsible than necessary, because that's something the animal does, but he is responsible for controlling these things, controlling the fire and controlling the animals where they graze. And that's why he's he's responsible for making restitution. Okay, this is, we're moving right along here. The next subject here has to do with are you familiar with the term bailment? This is actually going to take us from verse 7 to verse 15. It's not a word that we use all the time.
Is it related to bail?
No. Up at the top in the introduction section, there's a Merriam-Webster entry for that.
Mm-hmm.
This has to do with the transfer of possession, but not ownership of personal property as goods for a limited time or specified purpose, such that the individual or business entity taking possession is liable to some extent for the loss or damage of the property. Now, for me, the first thing that comes to mind is storage facilities. They're taking possession, you're giving them possession of your, or not possession, you're giving them possession of your property, but not the ownership of your property. And there's a liability there. The banking system, stock brokerages, safety deposit box, anybody who keeps something for somebody else. In addition to that, that would also include renting or borrowing, because you're using somebody else's property. They're giving it to you for a certain purpose, and if something happens to it while it's in your care, you're responsible for it. And so this is all comes under the heading of bailment. Let's read through this. I'm just going to read through verses 7 through 13. And then I want to go look, because this actually goes on, and what I'm going to read from the Talmud actually applies to those passages and the ones after. But I want to read these passages up to verse 13, and then I want to look at a Talmud passage and how they understood this. They saw this as the principle of guardianship. And so they actually came up with certain types of guardians. We'll see 3 of them in the scriptures. They actually list 4. So let's start with verse 7. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he is caught, must pay back double. There's the standard practice. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. This is important, because even if it's stolen, if the thief is not found, how does the owner actually know whether or not a thief broke in, or if the person to whom he entrusted his goods actually did something with it? So then here's our verse, our key verse. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. So it may be the case where the judges have to decide, even if they were stolen, but it's hard to determine that. They have to decide whether or not the person who last touched them was actually the one who took them, or if somebody else did. So there's investigation involved.
Security cameras and so forth?
Yes. They have to go look through all that stuff. Now, If a man gives a donkey or an ox or a sheep to any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies, is injured, or is taken away, we'll talk about that word. This is not the same as stolen. While no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay his hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. But if the animal is stolen from the neighbor, he must make restitution to the owner, because he was responsible for watching over it. If it is torn to pieces by wild animals, he shall bring the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. We'll talk about the verses 14 and 15 after we're done with the rest of this, but that's where there's someone who's borrowing or renting. Okay, so at this point, we have a borrower in verse 14 and a renter, or something that was taken for hire in verse 15. And then everything we were reading up to this point, 7 through 13, had to do with someone giving something to their neighbor for safekeeping. There's no mention there of the exchange of money. Now, with borrowing and renting, it's the same thing, only there's money involved with renting. Here, with the other guardianship, or someone puts something in your care, the scripture doesn't mention anything about fees. So, the rabbis, doing what they do, had to kind of muddle through that and give us some definitions. You want to say something, John?
I just wanted to ask, just to clarify a little bit, I mean, why would there not be any penalty if the animal, right, that was under my care because you asked me to take care of him, and while he's under my care, he gets, eaten by wolves or whatever. Why wouldn't I have some responsibility for that?
First of all, the judges would obviously have to determine whether or not you made any effort.
Okay.
But other than that, a wild animal is a wild animal.
Yeah.
And
That's an act of God.
Well, an act of the animal.
Right. Well,
yeah, but say for example, you have a sheep, and you notice that a bear has climbed into some fencing and is about to eat it.
Yeah.
You're not obligated to go in there and take on the bear, to stop him. And so that's sort of beyond your control. Yeah. So you did your best, but wild animals don't follow the rules. So, that's a good question. So let's look at these different guardians. See, now all of your Talmud passages are stapled together. This is Talmud Bava Metzia, chapter 7, and this is on page 121. Up in the upper right-hand corner, yeah.
Oh, okay, I see it.
Yeah.
Where's the page?
It's like the second to last, or third to last.
Okay, I see that. Half a number.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's fine, thank you.
In order to make it more readable, I had to lessen the margins.
You had to shift it, yeah.
Do you have it, Randy?
I got it.
Okay. So down at the bottom, this is chapter 7, verse 8. Skip down to where you first see the highlighted portion. It says there are 4 guardians. The unpaid guardian, that's the one we read about.
Excuse me, this is a podcast?
Yes.
It is, yeah, come on in.
I'm sorry for being late.
No, come on in.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Have a seat anywhere.
Yeah, these are the handouts.
Thank you.
There's a package there, a package over there.
In fact, let me help you find that passage. We're on says the third to the last one?
Yep.
Yes. This is where the outlines on the front. This is, we're reading from this right now. Okay, so there are 4 guardians. The unpaid guardian is the first one. That's the one that is actually in Scripture. A borrower, that's the one that we're going to talk about in verse 14. And then there's the paid guardian. That's the one that we don't really see paid or unpaid in the passages that we just read. They had to discern that because for someone who borrows or rents, obviously, there's paid or unpaid. So obviously, they're giving it to someone for guardianship. There's going to be paid and unpaid. And then it mentions the one who leases or the renter. Now, we're going to come back to this, but well, actually, no, I want to read this whole section here. The reason they're listing these four guardians is that it says that their liabilities are different. See at the very end, it says, each of whom guard an object entrusted to them, but their liabilities are different. So let's see what those liabilities are. An unpaid guardian, I'll tell you what. Let's talk about the oath before we do this, okay? Because this is where the oath comes into play. Okay, here's the situation. There's going to be times when you, like for example, someone has guardianship and a thief comes and takes the items, and the judges are not, they're not able to discern whether or not there really was a thief. What are you going to do? Say the guy is innocent. Say someone really did break in. The owner doesn't know that, and yet the owner is now uncompensated because they cannot determine whether or not the thief really broke in and took these items. So this is where the oath comes in. And we'll see in Talmud that there's a choice here. The person who was the guardian has the option to pay it off. Okay? Or if they want, they can take an oath. And this is in verse 10. This is in verse 10. The animal dies, is injured, or is taken away. That has to do not with theft, but a situation where, enemies came in. Like Israel's enemies came in and raided the place. That's not a standard theft. That's something entirely different. That also would be outside the control of the guardian, as would be if the animal dies or is injured itself. So, if it cannot be determined for sure what happened here, the issue between them will be settled by taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the person's property. This is the last resort, since they can't say for sure whether or not a thief broke in or if the neighbor actually laid his hands on it. The oath here is important because it has to do with the second commandment. Remember about not taking the Lord's name in vain? And when we were studying that, I said that is about taking oaths where you invoke God's name. And there it says that he will not hold anyone guiltless who takes his name in vain. You take an oath and you take it falsely. So essentially what's going on here is they are turning the matter over to God. They can't determine it. They admit it. And so for the guardian, he's entering into a very, very serious relationship. If he's innocent, he can take this oath. Everything's going to be cool. However, if he takes this oath and he really did steal his the things with which he was entrusted, now he has to deal directly with God. And this, in a court of law, settles the matter. Now, there are options, of course, whether someone wants to take the oath or pay it off. And we're going to see that in some of these passages, what happens if the thief is eventually found. So those are the four guardians. Now let's go back to our Talmud passage here, Bava Metzia. 7, verse 8. And on page 122, where it says that their liabilities differ. So here it says, an unpaid guardian takes an oath in all cases. And a borrower pays in all cases. A paid guardian and one who leases takes an oath in the case of injury or capture. I'm just reading the yellow highlighted sections. He takes a guardian or one who leases takes an oath in the case of injury and capture or death, but pays for the loss or the theft. So depending on what type of a guardian it is, they might have to pay. Because, well, let's see, for the unpaid guardian, he gets to take an oath because he hasn't received a fee. And a borrower pays in all cases because he got service. Say he borrowed an animal. He received some service in that, even though it was taken. Now with the paid guardian and the one who leases, they get to take an oath because like for example, it says here, forced to capture by robbers, which is regarded as an accident for which he is not responsible. So I wanted you to read this because I want you to see that there are stipulations with these 4 types of guardians and whether or not they are allowed to take that oath or whether or not they're required to pay. We're getting into some details there which you probably won't remember, but I want you to realize that in this particular, in these cases here where there's an oath required, that somebody had to work out some details and how culpable each one of the 4 guardians are in the different situations. Let's go to, there's another one here called Bava Metzia, and it's chapter 3. And it's on page 83. This has to do more with, again, has more to do with the oath, but this deals with the question, what happens if the thief is eventually found? Everybody have page 83?
It's the page right before where we were.
Okay. So I guess it's the 4th one from the back, right?
Yeah.
It looks like this.
Yeah.
You see it? One more. Okay, I want to go back this way. See, all my pages are separate, that's why. One more. There you go. Okay. Now, what happens if the thief is found, and how does that affect whether or not the person took an oath or they offered to pay for it, even though they were innocent? So, this is in verse 1. If a man entrusts an animal or utensils to his neighbor, and they are stolen or lost, and he pays for them, in other words, he opted not to go with the oath, or even if he declares to the Beit Din, that's the court, that he intended to pay for them, declining to swear, okay? Since it was ruled that the unpaid guardian may swear, I'm going to skip over some of these brackets, and had not missed them, since it was ruled that the unpaid guardian may swear and be free, the thief, if he is found, must pay double. And if he slaughtered or sold the animal, like we read in the first 4 verses, he must pay 4 or 5. He even quotes our verse there, chapter 22. Here's the big question. To whom does he pay? Now in this case, remember that the guardian opted not to take the oath, and he opted to pay. So to whom does the thief pay if the thief actually is eventually found? To the one whom the object was deposited. By choosing to pay rather than swear, the guardian assumed all the rights of the owner, including payments and fines. Since he chose to pay, the original owner has already gotten his money. If he swears not wishing to pay, the thief, if he is found, must pay kefil or double, and if he is slaughtered or sold, he must pay 4 or 5 full restitution. To whom does he pay? He pays to the owner. So, if the thief is not found and the guardian decides to take an oath, then if the thief is found, the thief has to pay double to the original owner. Whereas if he chooses to pay for it himself and not take the oath, then if the thief is found, the thief has to pay the guardian. The owner has already gotten his compensation. Somebody had to figure these things out. Okay, let's go down to the next section. Any questions on that? Okay, let's go down to the next section. This is verse 14 and 15. Here it says, if a man borrows an animal from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is present, he must make restitution. I'm sorry, while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal and the borrower will not have to pay, because both of them are watching over the animal if the owner is present. If the animal was hired, then the money paid for the hire covers the loss. So there's a few more details on this. Let's look at the handout. This is Bava Metzia 8, verse 1, and that's on page 125. So the differences here is whether or not it was rented or was borrowed and whether or not the owner was present. So if a man borrows a cow or borrows its owner with it, and borrows its owner with it, or hires its owner with it, or if he first hires the owner and then borrows the cow and it dies, he is not responsible. That's how they're understanding the passage that we just read. But if the owner was with him, then he need not pay. But if he first borrows the cow and only subsequently borrows or hires its owner and it dies, he is liable. Somebody had to work out the details as to whether or not they were both hired at the same time. Apparently, if both are hired at the same time, the animal and the owner, then there's culpability with the owner. But somebody had to work out the difference because the original agreement had to do with both the owner and the animal being rented. Go down to the next one. It says if the owner was not with him, he must surely pay. So, again, a few more details there. I like going back to these Talmud sections because the Bible is very, at least in these passages, very succinct. Get a lot of the what if this situation, what if that, and also applying the modern terms to some of these things, like bailment, for example, I think helps to make more sense because otherwise we're only thinking about somebody loaning an animal to somebody. Well, eventually when they got into the land, there will be businesses set up. And such things like this will be considered not just animals, but other items. And those things have to be worked out. And in certain cases too, like with an animal, that animal only works well with the owner, then you would hire the owner with the animal. So that consideration would have to be understood. So, there's one section, there's one thing here, we're going to move on. There's one thing here left in the theft section, which is not normally considered, we wouldn't consider it in our society, and it has to do with marriage. and the bride price. Now, as you know, that in ancient cultures, a man didn't just propose to a woman. There were obligations to the parents, especially to the father, and it usually was in the form of a bride price. Different bride prices for different societies, different stipulations. This is in verse 16 and 17. So it seems a little bit odd that we'd be talking about sexual relations in a theft chapter, but really the issue here has to do with the bride price. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. So this is not anything to do with rape. This is a consensual relationship. She's not pledged to be married. There are other passages that deal with that. But there's a consensus, a consent here. Nonetheless, even though there's a responsibility here for him to marry her, the father still has the final say on this. And no doubt he would talk this over with his daughter. But if in the end they decide not to marry, there's still the obligation because, for lack of a better term, he has disgraced her or he has deflowered her, so to speak. And that is, in that society, that's going to affect, I guess, the range of suitors she might have in the future. Especially if you're in a society where there's a concern for virginity in a marriage. And so he's still entitled to that bride price. Again, this is sort of an exception, like I was talking about how this is here because it's an exception to the standard theft rule where double is required. In this case, there's nothing like that. It's just whether or not the bride price is paid, even if they refuse to get married, or the father refuses that marriage. It's a theft issue in a way because there's damages. There's a loss of the bride price. If you'd like to read more about some of these things, because there's a lot of stipulations when it comes to things like rape, or if someone seduces a woman who's engaged. You can read up a little bit more in Deuteronomy chapter 22. You'll see the reference down there, verses 13 through 29. Let's move on to a different topic here. I'm not going to cover these in depth, but I wanted to mention them because suddenly we're changing topics here to idolatry. We're no longer in the theft section. Like I said last week, it's hard to categorize some of these passages because for the most part you're talking about a certain subject. Then it detours a little bit. Last time we were talking about personal injury, and by the end of the chapter we were talking about one animal killing another one. In this case, it was primarily about theft, property damage, and bailment. Now it's taken a slight detour. And this is actually the end of a section here. I'll explain that when we get done with this. Let me just read these and just make a comment. We're not going to spend much time on them. Verse 18, do not allow a sorceress to live. Verse 19, anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. And whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. Now, that middle one seems to be a little bit out of place, but I think in all these cases, since we see sorcery, which has to do with idolatry, sacrificing to any other god is about idolatry. In context, I think that middle one about sexual relations probably is something to do with pagan worship. It's not something that somebody would normally do, but it would be something that would not be unusual when it came to some of these pagan religions. So I think these all have to do with idolatry, and that might be the reason for the death penalty. This is a capital offense. You'll see in the handout that in number 6, idolatry, I got a number of verses, other references tied to these verses if you'd like to read more on them. The one for verse 18 for the sorceress, there's a reference there for Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 22. The word sorcery is actually listed there, but you get it in the context of the other things that are forbidden. It helps us to understand that sorcery was about contacting non-living human beings or other worldly type spirits for the sake of getting information. In that section, the passages that are usually quoted have to do with how God is going to raise up a prophet like Moses. Remember that passage? It's usually interpreted to mean the Messiah. But the point when you read the whole passage is that they're going into a land where there was pagan worship, and people consulted the dead, they consulted familiar spirits to get forbidden information. And until they wipe out all these societies there, they're going to be prone to be influenced by them. And in the first paragraph in that reference there, he says, don't do sorcery, don't do divination, don't do all these things. Well, why would someone do that? Well, they're trying to get extra information, the secret information. And then he goes on and talks about how he's going to raise up a prophet like Moses, because one day Moses is going to die. In fact, he's giving that speech in Deuteronomy because it's his last speech. He's going to go up to Mount Ebal after this, and he's going to pass away. How are we going to learn what God says? Up to that point, he was in direct contact with the Lord. Now what? How are we going to know what to do? And so he's letting them know you don't have to turn to sorcery. You don't have to turn to divination or consulting the dead or Ouija boards or anything like that, tarot cards. Once Moses is gone, he is going to raise up prophets, and he did. He raised up other prophets. I think the Messiah is probably included, is understood to be one of those individuals. But all along the way, God has raised up prophets, and I will get my message to you. I think he also knows that if the people of Israel would use these other methods, they're not going to be hearing from God. They're going to be hearing from something else. And remember, and again, these 3 crimes that we mentioned here are capital crimes. In Israel, or with the Israelites, remember that the Lord was their king. So the worship of any other god besides him, if you look at it from a political standpoint, is an act of treason. And even in modern society, sedition and treason will probably get you executed. And so that's really what worshiping another god in Israel at that time would mean. So it's not a big surprise that these would be capital offenses. These are just different ways to commit acts of treason under this economy, or under this situation. Now, there's a reason I stopped here, and this is where we're going to end up tonight. I've got a few other comments, but we started off in chapter 21. Remember I said that verse 1 there probably is best translated, these are the rulings, or the judgments that I'm going to set before you. This is pretty much the last, chapter 22, verse 20, is the last verse where there's actually a ruling. When you read this in the Hebrew, there's a change of format here. From this point on, the format that we see from verses 21 all the way through half of chapter 23 are of the same format as the 10 Commandments. You shall not. Now, when they translate that form in the Ten Commandments, the translators like to say, thou shalt not, or you shall not. When that same format appears in chapter 22, verse 21 and on, they just say, don't. It's the same idea. But we actually have the end of a section here that started in chapter 22, verse 1, that ended in chapter 22, verse 20. And that's why I wanted to cut it off there. The subject of biblical justice does continue. What we see following this, from where we stopped, has to do with judicial procedure. He has something to say to the people, to the layman, and then in chapter 23, I think his comments are directed more to the judges in the courts on what not to do. But we don't see any rulings or judgment for it. These are admonitions, these are warnings, don't do this, but we don't see any rulings about it. So that's a section unto itself. Also, if you feel real ambitious, the subject of biblical justice continues in the book of Deuteronomy. I mean, there's other things along the way in Leviticus and in Numbers, but there's a big section in Deuteronomy starting with chapter 12 all the way through 26. That's why I was referencing some of these passages in Deuteronomy, because you get more information there. God did not really need to give them that information until that time, because many of the rules, judgments, practices that he put in place in the book of Deuteronomy have to do with things that they would be doing in the land. And so I think he anticipated the 40 years of wandering, because as you know, when they were at Mount Sinai, they were there for almost a year, and it was only an 11-day journey from there to Kadesh Barnea, where they were supposed to enter the promised land from the south. I think God anticipated this 40-year wandering, that they were going to rebel, because he didn't give the judgments and the practices and all the commandments that are in Deuteronomy at that time, because they were about to enter the land. Apparently he knew something was up. And so 40 years later, we get the book of Deuteronomy, and we get those additional rules and commands. And so, like I said, chapter 12 through chapter 26, if you want to know more about biblical justice, you'll find some more information there. Believe it or not, we've just covered the basics. We covered the basics of personal injury, the basics of theft, property damage, bailment, and all those were delineations of the Ten Commandments. And remember, the second half of the Ten Commandments reflect what we studied when we learned about the Noahide laws, the laws that God gave to Noah back in Genesis chapter 9. So that's how it all ties together. In your, at the very end, right, I did this last week, but I have a link there to a Mishnah website, and all the references that we looked at tonight. In fact, I think there's an extra one there. You can go there and find those. All these Talmud or Mishnah tractates are grouped together under 6 headings, and you'll find what we've studied tonight under a section called Nizikin, which means damages, and under there you'll see the different tractates we've looked at, Bava Metzia, Bava Kama, things like that. So that's all I have for you tonight. Does anyone have any questions regarding either what we've talked about tonight or any of the 3 previous classes? Noahide laws, 10 commandments, personal injury, or tonight's subject?
What's the meaning of Bava Metzia?
Oh, there's Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Bathra. And at one time, they all used to be combined into one book, or one tractate, and it was quite large, and so they split it into 3. Bava, I believe, is Aramaic for gate. And, yeah, and so Kama, Metzia, and Bathra have the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. How they came up with gate, I don't know, but it was a way of dividing a big book into 3 parts. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you.
Thank you, James, for teaching us the last 4 weeks. Quick announcement. So next week we won't have class. We're going to take the week off. So there won't be anything online, or there won't be anything here. Then we'll come back in 2 weeks, which I believe is February 25th. Is that the right number? I forgot to look at the calendar. I'm teaching, and I'm going to do 3 weeks on the kingdom, the biblical track of kingdom throughout the Bible. And so the first week we'll look at the Creator King and pretty much trace the Old Testament view of king and kingship and kingdom. The second week will be the Messiah King, and so we'll focus on Jesus, and we'll go through the New Testament as Messiah, who fulfills what God established in the Old Testament. And then the third class we will look in Isaiah and in the Gospel of John, and look at the I am statements that are in both, and look at the Old Testament, New Testament I am statements about Jesus, and why Jesus said what he said, why Isaiah through messenger of God established that, and how that all kind of ties into kingdom and kingships. And so we'll look at those statements which you may or may not be as familiar with through that lens of biblical kingdom and kingship. So it should be a fun, quick little 3-week study. Then Timothy will teach 2 weeks after that. And then we'll take a significant break, but we'll talk about that when we get to that, because of Easter Holy Week and a missions conference that we're having here at the church and all of those kinds of things. But we'll talk more about that later. So
We need to RSVP like every time.
no, not for the class. Just come on out. There's plenty of room, and
Because I don't know if I'm going to start to work in the night.
yeah.
This day.
We do record every time that we teach, and those are on our YouTube channel. And if you're on Facebook, we have a Facebook group that you can join and be a part of, and we try to every week post that YouTube video into that Facebook group too, just to kind of spread the wealth as best as we can. So yeah, just come on up. Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Nothing next week, the week after.
Nothing next week. In 2 weeks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Jim.
We'll be right back.
All right.
Why are we